Case 1. Mark Burnt. For more than 30 years, he was just the quiet third-grade teacher at a school in South Los Angeles, the kind of man parents never thought twice about. No criminal record, steady evaluations, the same familiar face in the same classroom, decade after decade. And that ordinariness is exactly why, when a photo technician at a drugstore saw what he had dropped off to be developed, almost no one could believe what the most trusted adult in those children's school days had been doing all along. His name was Mark Burnt. He was born in 1950, and he had worked inside the Los Angeles Unified School District, the system known as LAUSD. Since the late 1970s, he began teaching third grade at Miramonte Elementary School in 1979, and he stayed there, in that same building, for more than 3 decades. To the people around him, he was unremarkable in the most reassuring way. He lived quietly. He drove an old Volkswagen. He listened to classical music and spent his free time camping in the desert. He had no criminal history beyond traffic tickets. His personnel file showed 5 straight evaluation cycles over a full decade, rating him as meeting the standard, with not a single disciplinary action on record. He was the last person, on paper, that anyone would worry about. Miramonte Elementary sits in a neighborhood south of downtown Los Angeles that is overwhelmingly Latino, low-income, and immigrant. Nearly every child at the school qualified for free or reduced-price meals. Many of the families spoke Spanish at home, and many would later give their statements to the court through interpreters. These were families who trusted the school completely, who sent their children through its doors believing the adults inside would protect them. For parents working long hours, often in more than one job, the school was not just a place of learning, it was a sanctuary, a safe place where their children would be looked after by professionals. That faith is precisely what makes the betrayal at the heart of this case so total, because the man they trusted with their youngest children had been quietly violating that trust for years, while collecting his paycheck and his steady evaluations. The children Burnt would ultimately be charged with harming. 23 of them in all were young, with most accounts placing them between 6 and 10 years old. The crimes he was charged with spanned the years 2008 to 2010. The form those crimes took is not something this account is going to walk through. What matters is that a man entrusted with the care of very young children betrayed that trust in the most profound way imaginable, and that he did it for years inside an ordinary classroom during ordinary school hours. The thing that finally exposed him had nothing to do with the school at all. Late in 2010, Burnt dropped off rolls of film to be developed at a drugstore, a CVS, on the coast in Redondo Beach. The technician who processed those images saw something so disturbing that the only sane response was to pick up the phone and call the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. That single phone call from a stranger doing a routine job is the only reason this case ever came to light. It is worth pausing on that, because it tells you something about how invisible this kind of abuse can be. For years, the parents had not known, the other teachers had not known, the administrators had not known, or had not acted on what little had once been flagged. The thing that finally broke it open was pure chance. A worker at a photo counter who refused to look away from what was in front of him. What followed was a long, careful investigation led by the Sheriff's Department's Special Victims Bureau. This was not a case that could be rushed. The lead investigator, a sergeant named Dan Scott, later explained to the press just how painstaking the forensic work had been. It took roughly 7 months simply to confirm the nature of the biological evidence recovered from Burnt's classroom. It took another 6 to 7 months after that to process Burnt's own genetic profile, his DNA, and match it to what investigators had found. A covert surveillance team was used to obtain a sample from him. All told, more than a year passed between that drugstore tip and the moment the handcuffs came out, because investigators wanted the case to be airtight. When detectives searched Burnt's home, the scale of what they were dealing with grew. They recovered well over 400 photographs in total once everything was accounted for. At least 23 children were identified from the images. Around 10 more children in those photographs were never identified at all, which means the true number of victims may never be fully known. After the arrest became public, 7 more former students came forward on their own, with allegations of their own, a grim indication that the charged cases represented only the part of the picture investigators could prove. Each new account added another family to the list of people who had sent a child into that classroom believing they were safe. The arrest came at the end of a 13-month investigation. On the 30th of January 2012, Mark Berndt was arrested at his home. He was 61 years old, a man approaching the end of an unremarkable-looking career, finally being held to account for what that career had concealed. His bail was set at $23 million, an extraordinary figure that reflected exactly how seriously the court viewed the danger he represented. The fallout at the school was immediate and almost unprecedented. Within a week, the district took the drastic step of suspending the entire Miramonte teaching staff, all 88 teachers, along with dozens of support employees, and temporarily replacing the whole faculty while it tried to restore some measure of trust with terrified parents. The legal resolution came on the 15th of November, 2013. Berndt pleaded no contest in Los Angeles County Superior Court before Judge George Lamelli to 23 felony counts. He was sentenced to 25 years in state prison and required to register as a lifelong offender. His own defense attorney stood in that courtroom and argued that his client was not a monster, that mistakes had been made, and that there was no credible evidence Berndt had ever touched a student inappropriately. The mothers of the victims, many speaking in Spanish through interpreters, told the judge otherwise, describing children who could no longer do the simplest ordinary things without fear. One mother spoke of a daughter who could no longer even eat a cookie. These were not abstract harms, they were the daily, lasting wounds carried home by small children, and the parents who described them had waited years for the chance to say so out loud in front of the man responsible. The district superintendent, when the arrest first broke, said publicly that he was sickened and horrified by what Berndt had done. But the criminal sentence was only part of the reckoning, because this case became a landmark for a different reason. In 2014, the school district agreed to pay just over $139 million to settle claims brought on behalf of 81 students and dozens of parents. At the time, it was the largest payout any school district in the country had ever made in a child abuse case. And it did not stop there. More than a decade later, in the spring of 2026, the Los Angeles Times reported that the district had agreed to pay another $30 million and more to 19 additional former students, pushing the total amount paid out past $200 million. One of the attorneys representing the victims marked the moment by pointing out that 14 years after the arrest, survivors were still coming forward, and that the warning signs in this case had been obvious all along. That phrase, obvious all along, is the heart of the tragedy. This was not a man who slipped through a perfect system. He slipped through a system that had been handed reasons to act and chose, again and again, not to. By the spring of 2026, the total the district had paid to survivors and their families had climbed past $200 million after another group of 19 former students reached a settlement of more than $30 million. The money is staggering, but it is also a kind of confession written in numbers, an institution paying, over and over, for warnings it had received and buried decades before a drugstore clerk forced the truth into the light. And they had been. This is the part of the story that should never be forgotten, because Mark Berndt should have been stopped years earlier, long before that drugstore tip. Back in 1983, a parent reported that he had exposed himself during a student field trip to a museum. The principal wrote a memo documenting the complaint. It was filed away and nothing happened. The memo itself would not surface again until civil lawyers dug it out of the district's records decades later, a piece of paper that had quietly recorded a warning the school chose not to act on. Then, in 1993, a young girl reported that he had reached under her desk and tried to touch her. Her mother formally reported it the following year. The sheriff's department actually investigated this one, but prosecutors declined to file charges. And so Berndt went right back to his classroom, back to the same desks and the same children for nearly 2 more decades. A second concrete warning, looked at by law enforcement, and still it changed nothing about his access to children. Worst of all, when the district finally moved to remove him, the slow machinery of the law allowed his attorneys to negotiate, and the district actually paid him $40,000 to drop his appeal so that he would simply resign and keep his pension. He was quietly ushered out the door, his record intact. A textbook example of the problem where a dangerous employee is passed along rather than confronted. A judge would later fine the district thousands of dollars in the civil litigation, for failing to hand over hundreds of the photographs it had in its possession. There was even a second teacher at the same school, arrested in the same period on entirely separate and unrelated allegations, one accuser in that matter later recanting, which only deepened the sense among parents that the institution they had trusted had been failing their children on more than one front. The $40,000 buyout in particular became a national symbol of a problem educators have a blunt name for: the practice of quietly moving a dangerous employee along instead of confronting what they have done, passing the danger to the next school or simply out the door with a pension intact. Mark Berndt was a man the system trusted by default for over 30 years, and that default trust is exactly what allowed him to operate. But the next man on this list did not simply hold one position of trust over children. He held two at the same time, and he wrapped himself in something even harder to question than a teacher's reputation. Case 2. Jordan Henderson. He was the kind of man two separate communities had decided to believe in. By day, he taught a combined 4th and 5th grade class at an elementary school in rural Washington. On Sundays, he led worship at a small church where his own father was the lead pastor. Two pulpits, in a sense, two captive audiences of trusting families. And for 2 full school years, the children in his classroom tried to warn each other about him while not a single adult understood what was happening. His name is Jordan Henderson. He was born around 1990, and he had built a life that looked, from the outside, like a portrait of decency. He taught at Evergreen Elementary School in Lake Bay, Washington, part of the Peninsula School District in Pierce County, and according to the state's public records, he had worked there since at least 2018. He had been at his father's church even longer, since around 2011. By the time the case reached its conclusion, he was in his mid-30s, a man who had spent well over a decade carefully accumulating the kind of standing in a community that makes a person seem beyond suspicion. He had served at his father's church, Wellspring Fellowship, a small congregation in the area, as a worship pastor and deacon since 2011. He was married with 4 children of his own, including 2 young daughters. His mother had taught 3rd grade at the very same elementary school, deepening the family's roots in the institution. He had no criminal history whatsoever. Everything about his life was arranged to look trustworthy, and in a small community where everyone knows the pastor's family and the teacher down the hall, that appearance of trustworthiness was nearly impossible to question. He was, in the language his family used, a man of the highest character. His church biography spoke warmly of his service and his family. His standing in both the school and the congregation meant that any child who tried to raise an alarm would be doubted before he was, because the weight of 2 trusted institutions stood behind him. That is the quiet machinery of how a man like this operates. The more respected he is, the harder it becomes for a child to be believed. The victims were 4 girls, all of them under the age of 12, all of them students in his combined classroom across the 2022 and 2023 school years and into the year that followed. One of them was only 9 when it began, and she endured it across 2 school years. That is as much of the harm itself as needs to be said. What deserves the weight here is something the court records revealed that is almost unbearable to think about. The children knew. The abuse was talked about among the students. In one account, several girls in the class made a pact with each other to keep watch, to try to witness what was being done, to protect one another, because the adult in the room was the danger. For 2 school years, a group of little girls quietly stood guard over each other, while the grown-ups around them saw nothing. Think about what that means. Children who were 9, 10, 11 years old understood that the adult placed in charge of their education was a threat, and rather than being protected by the system around them, they organized to protect themselves. Prosecutors would later describe how the man had told one of the children that what he was doing was simply something normal that teachers do, and instructed her not to tell anyone, the kind of manipulation designed to keep a child silent and confused. The mothers of those children would later describe the aftermath in court in terms no parent should ever have to use. They spoke of daughters who went from vibrant to withdrawn, of nightmares and sleeplessness, of social regression and lost friendships, of children who could no longer function in the building where it had happened. Several families pulled their daughters out of school entirely to teach them at home, unwilling to send them back into a system that had failed them so completely. The damage did not end when the abuse did. For these children, it became a permanent feature of their young lives. One mother told the judge that the man's name had become like a curse word in their house, a name that simply could not be spoken, comparing him to the villain in a children's book, whose name no one dares say. The children's 2 years of quiet vigilance ended only when an adult finally listened. The wall broke in February of 2024, when one child told her parents what had been happening, and that report climbed quickly up to school administrators and then to the Pierce County Sheriff's Department. It is a hard thing to sit with that the system designed by adults to protect children had been outperformed for 2 long school years by a group of frightened little girls watching out for one another. The adults caught up only at the very end. By March, Henderson was placed on administrative leave. On the 18th of April 2024, deputies from the Pierce County Sheriff's Department arrested him at his home. He was 34. He pleaded not guilty and was released on $100,000 bail. And in a move that would echo through the entire case, his father went on social media to defend him, telling the world he knew his son to be of the highest character and quality as a man. At one point, Henderson was briefly returned to jail over an alleged bail violation involving gatherings with minors, a development that alarmed the families following the case. Over time, as the investigation continued and more was understood, the charges grew until they reached 13 counts in total. Pornography was reportedly discovered on his laptop during the investigation, though that material was handled separately and did not form the basis of the charges he ultimately faced. The picture that emerged was of a man whose private conduct bore no resemblance to the figure 2 communities had chosen to believe in. The investigation was led by the Pierce County Sheriff's Department, and the case was tried by the County Prosecuting Attorney's Office. The trial got underway in the first days of December 2025, with opening statements on the 9th in Pierce County Superior Court, before Judge Alicia Marie Burton. Prosecutors laid out how Henderson had operated, describing a man who deliberately kept his classroom loud and chaotic and blurred the ordinary boundaries that are supposed to protect children, so that what he was doing could hide in plain sight during instruction. The defense, for its part, tried to wave the whole thing away, with one attorney dismissively describing the case as the movement of accountability for misconduct somehow reaching down to 4th and 5th graders, as though children that age could not possibly be believed. It was an argument that asked the jury to treat the consistent accounts of 4 separate young girls as some kind of mass invention. 29 letters of support for Henderson were submitted before sentencing, and his father had continued, throughout the long wait for trial, to describe his son publicly as a great husband, a great father, and a great teacher. The jury deliberated across parts of 3 days. At sentencing, one of the deputy prosecutors described Henderson as an untreated offender who had shown no acknowledgement of what he had done, no interest in changing, and who kept around him people who refused to hold him accountable, a pointed reference to the family and the church that had defended him throughout. It was a portrait not just of one man, but of the protective wall a respected reputation can build around someone, a wall that the children in his classroom had been left to climb entirely on their own. On the 5th of January 2026, the jury delivered its answer. Henderson was convicted on 12 of the 13 counts, and the jury added special verdicts, finding that he had abused a position of trust. Then, on the 8th of May 2026, Judge Burton handed down the maximum the law allowed, an indeterminate sentence of 792 months to life. In plainer terms, that is a minimum of 66 years behind bars before he can even ask to be considered for release, a request he would have to make to a state review board that is under no obligation to grant it. For a man in his 30s, it is a sentence that almost certainly means the rest of his life. The judge restricted his contact with his own 4 biological children to supervised visits only. The defense had asked for a sentence of around 16 years. They were not remotely close. Henderson indicated he would appeal, but the verdict and the sentence stood as one of the most severe outcomes any teacher on this list received, a measure of how seriously the court took both the crimes and the position of trust he had abused to commit them. At sentencing, one of the prosecutors described Henderson plainly as an untreated offender who had shown no acknowledgement of what he had done, no interest in getting better, and who surrounded himself with people unwilling to hold him accountable. That last point cut to the heart of it. The families of the victims went on to file a civil lawsuit against the Peninsula School District, alleging it had failed to protect their children. Their attorney told reporters they believed the district knew, or at the very least should have known, what was happening, given how openly the abuse had been discussed among the students. After his arrest, the church placed Henderson on leave and he ultimately resigned from the school district. But those steps came only after the damage was done. The institutions that had given him his standing distanced themselves the moment the truth became undeniable, the same pattern that repeats across nearly every case here, where the embrace is warm and public right up until the conviction, and then suddenly cools into careful statements about former employees and former members. Henderson, for his part, signalled that he intended to appeal, but the verdict and the indeterminate sentence stood. His own daughters were now among the children he could see only under supervision. A man who had built two lives, one at the front of a classroom and one at the front of a congregation, had managed to weaponize both, and it had taken a group of 4th and 5th grade girls watching out for one another to finally bring the whole carefully maintained image down. And the most damning fact of all sits in the court record itself. The abuse was openly discussed among the students for 2 school years. A classroom full of children understood that something was wrong long before any adult did, which raises the question of how many chances the adults in that building had to simply listen. Jordan Henderson hid behind the combined authority of the schoolhouse and the church, and a father who insisted to the very end that his son could do no wrong. The next case crosses an ocean, and it asks an even harder question, because the man at its centre had already been caught once, decades earlier, and the system still handed him back the keys. If stories like this matter to you, take a second to subscribe. It is free, and it is the simplest way to keep these investigations coming. Case 3. Robert Gould. He had already been convicted once. Back in the late 1980s, a court in England found him guilty of abusing 5 boys, and then it let him go with a sentence so light that, when he walked free, he was actually permitted to go back to working with vulnerable people. It would take more than 30 years, the courage of men who had been carrying this since childhood, and one survivor finally typing out a report online before the full scale of what Robert Gould had done would finally be answered for. Gould was a primary school teacher at Southend Junior School in Rushden, a town in Northamptonshire, England. He taught there across the 1970s and into the 1980s, and like the man in the previous case, he did not hold just one position of trust. He was also a leader at a local Methodist church youth group, which gave him a second doorway into the lives of children and a second community willing to vouch for him. In 1988, he was convicted of abusing 5 of his pupils. The sentence was short. Survivors would later describe it as extremely low, so low that it amounted to almost nothing measured against what he had done. And because the protections that exist today did not exist then, his release did not end his access to the vulnerable. He was, astonishingly, permitted on his release to work with vulnerable adults. He carried on with church and community work for decades, his single conviction apparently no barrier at all to a continued life among the very kind of people he had already been found guilty of harming. In the era before modern safeguarding law, a criminal record like his simply did not close the doors it would slam shut today. The victims in the full case numbered 14 boys, abused between 1971 and 1987, most of them around 10 years old at the time. The specific nature of what Gould did to them is not something this account will detail. When they finally walked into a courtroom to testify, they did so as men in their 50s and 60s, carrying decades of flashbacks, shame, nightmares, and depression. Some of them had never told a soul before. They had grown up, built careers and families, and carried this silently the whole time, each one believing the burden was his alone. To stand up in front of a jury and describe, as a grown man, the worst thing that had ever happened to him as a boy is an act of courage that is hard to fully measure, and 13 of them did exactly that. One of them, a man the court referred to only as Henry to protect his identity, had been 10 years old when the abuse began, and it was his disclosure that had produced Gould's first conviction back in 1988. Another man had reported what happened to him years earlier, but died in 2013, before charges could ever be brought. His account was not lost, though. Prosecutors brought it back into the case so that his voice would still be heard, even in his absence. so that a man who had died waiting for justice would still be counted among those Gould had to answer for. It was a quiet act of restoration, a refusal to let death erase a victim from the record. Civil compensation claims would eventually follow against the institutions that had given Gould his access, the local council and the church, an effort to force some accounting from the bodies that had housed and vouched for him across all those years. The thing that finally reopened all of it was almost ordinary. In March of 2021, an adult survivor sat down and filed a report online with Northamptonshire Police. That single report set off a major investigation. A detective constable named Alice Hornsby, working with a specialist police unit devoted to sexual offences, began the patient work of tracing former pupils from decades earlier, men now scattered across their own grown-up lives. From that one online report in early 2021, the case grew steadily, account by account, until it encompassed 14 separate victims. Each man who came forward had spent a lifetime believing he might have been the only one, or that no one would believe him now. And each discovery that there were others changed the shape of the case. What had been a single buried complaint became an overwhelming, corroborated record of a man who had abused children across 16 years. The charges had to be brought under the law as it stood at the time the crimes were committed, decades earlier, which meant working through an older framework of offences entirely. Prosecutors leaned on a tool that allows a court to recognise that an offence was committed repeatedly without requiring a separate verdict for every single incident across years of abuse, a way of conveying a sustained pattern rather than a list of isolated events. Gould's earlier conviction was also brought before the jury, admitted to show the jury the kind of man they were dealing with, and the account of the survivor who had died in 2013 was carefully reinstated into the case, so that a man who never lived to see this day would still have his testimony counted. The trial took place in January of 2025 at Northampton Crown Court, before His Honour Judge David Herbert. Gould denied everything. By denying it all, he forced 13 men to take the witness stand and relive, in front of strangers, the worst things that had ever happened to them. The prosecution made a simple and devastating point about those men. They had no opportunity to coordinate their stories, no way to compare notes, scattered as they were across decades and separate lives, and yet their accounts lined up, again and again, describing the same patterns from the same man across the same years. Several of the offences had taken place inside his classroom during the school day. Others had happened through the channels his second position gave him, the church youth work, and the activities he ran. The consistency across men who had never spoken to one another was, in the end, impossible to dismiss as coincidence or invention. The jury, made up of 9 men and 3 women, deliberated for more than 12 hours across 3 days. On the 27th of January, 2025, they convicted Gould on 29 of the 30 charges he faced, a near total sweep of the most serious offences on the indictment, including the gravest category of crime against a child that the old law recognised. Only a single count failed, one on which no evidence had ever actually been offered. To reach those verdicts, the jury had to weigh the testimony of more than a dozen separate men, each describing a similar escalating pattern in the same classroom and the same church youth setting across the same span of years, and they did not believe the denials of the man who had taught and mentored those boys. For the men who had carried this since they were boys, decades of being disbelieved or ignored ended in that single word from the jury, guilty, repeated nearly 30 times over. Sentencing was delayed once, in late February, because the report assessing how dangerous he remained had not been finished in time. A final procedural pause at the end of a case that had already waited more than 30 years. Finally, on the 26th of March, 2025, Robert Gould, by then 74 years old, was sentenced to 26 years in prison, made up of a set of consecutive terms that together added up to that total. For a man of his age, it was, in every practical sense, a sentence to die in prison. He was remanded into custody immediately, the comfortable retirement of a respectable churchman and former teacher replaced at last by a cell. The judge told him directly that he had seen no evidence of remorse and that he doubted Gould would ever feel any. The senior prosecutor put words to what the case had really exposed, describing how, behind an outwardly respectable mask, Gould had spent 16 years abusing the children in his care, and how that long campaign had wrecked the lives of 14 people. And then there is the part that should never have been allowed to happen. The reason Gould got to keep offending, the reason there even had to be a second case decades later, is that the system failed at every gate. His 1988 conviction did not stop him from working with vulnerable people afterward. Henry, the survivor from that first trial, later revealed that back in 1988, the head teacher of the school and a Methodist priest had actually sent the court letters of support for Gould. Multiple victims said they had complained to the head teacher at the time, when they were small boys, and that nothing was ever done. The complaints had been made, the adults had been told. The institution had the information it needed to stop him decades before it finally happened, and it did not act. And when he was first convicted, in 1988, figures of authority had lined up not behind the children but behind the man, sending the court letters vouching for his character, even as he stood convicted of harming 5 pupils. The whole tragedy unfolded in an era before the modern safeguarding checks that now exist, a time when a man convicted of harming children could simply be released and quietly allowed to return to the very kind of work that put children within his reach. Henry asked the only question that matters: where, he wanted to know, were the adults? He called for an inquiry, pointing out that Gould had been known for this, that there should have been protection, that teachers should have spotted it and asked questions. The investigation that finally caught up with Gould had grown from a single online report into the work of a specialist police unit devoted to sexual offences, the kind of dedicated team that did not exist in the era when his crimes were committed. That, in the end, is part of why it took so long. The boys he harmed in the 1970s and 80s grew up in a world with far fewer doors to knock on, far fewer people trained to listen, and a culture that too often chose the comfortable adult over the frightened child. Civil compensation claims were filed against the county council and the Methodist Church, an attempt to hold the institutions that had housed Gould to some kind of account. A national children's charity used the moment to urge anyone with concerns about a child to come forward, and the senior prosecutor framed the cost of the institutional silence in the plainest possible terms, describing a 16-year campaign of abuse that had wrecked the lives of 14 people, carried out by a man who had hidden the whole time behind a respectable mask. Robert Gould was finally answered for crimes that began more than half a century ago, a case that crawled toward justice across decades. The next case is almost the mirror image, because it moved with a speed that is genuinely jarring, and the man at its center was caught within months of ever setting foot in a classroom. Case 4. Corey Kapahulehua. Some of these cases take decades to surface. This one took weeks. A man walked into a high school classroom in Arizona in the late summer of 2021, and by the start of the very next year he had been fired and reported to the authorities. What is hard to absorb is not how long he got away with it, but how little time it took him to do tremendous harm, and how a routine hiring process waved him straight through the door. His name is Corey Kapahulehua. He was born around 1981, and he came to teaching later in life, after time in the United States Army and a string of other jobs. He earned a master's degree in teaching, in history and sociology, from a university program he completed in the years just before he entered the classroom. He had worked a scattered series of jobs before that, and he had served in the United States Army. In August of 2021, he was hired at the Arizona Agribusiness and Equine Center, a public charter high school known as AAEC, at its Mesa campus. By every official measure, he was qualified and cleared. The school had a credentialed new teacher with a clean record and the proper state clearance, and no reason on paper to watch him closely. He had passed a background check. He held a valid fingerprint clearance card, the credential Arizona requires of everyone who works in its classrooms. On paper, the system had checked its boxes and judged him safe to stand in front of students. He had no publicly disclosed criminal record, nothing in his history to trip an alarm. This is the uncomfortable truth that sits underneath his case. The screening tools that schools rely on are built to catch people who have already been caught. They are nearly useless against someone who has never been reported before, and Corey Kapahulehua walked through every checkpoint cleanly because, until that August, there was officially nothing to find. The victims were 2 of his students, a 14-year-old and a 17-year-old. both of whom he met that August within the first weeks of his arrival. Stop and consider that timeline for a moment. The harm did not begin after months of him slowly losing his way, or after some personal crisis unraveled him. It began almost immediately. In the very first weeks he had access to students, which strongly suggests that the classroom was never a calling for this man. It was an opportunity, and he took it the moment it was handed to him. What he did to those two students is not something this account will describe. The abuse of the younger student began on school grounds during the short window he was actually employed there, in the months between his hiring that August and his firing in January. After he was gone from the school, the contact with her did not stop. It simply moved off campus, continuing in other locations away from the building, which tells you that the classroom had only ever been the place he found her, not the limit of what he was willing to do. The school had been the hunting ground, and losing the job did not end the hunt. With the older student, the pattern was different but no less calculated. He pursued a relationship with her while she was still a minor, and in a detail that lays bare exactly how deliberate this was, he set up an online fundraiser to help her move out of her parents' home. Once she turned 18, the two of them moved in together. That fundraiser is the kind of detail that separates an impulsive crime from a planned one. This was a man working to pull a teenager out of her family and into his own life, building the logistics of it in public, step by step, while she was still legally a child. It was patient, and it was premeditated, and it was aimed squarely at a young person who had been taught to see him as an authority worth trusting. By the time she was old enough to legally leave home, the groundwork had already been laid, and the line between teacher and student had been deliberately erased long before. It is the cold deliberateness of it, more than anything, that lingers. This was not a momentary lapse. It was a campaign of manipulation aimed at the trust of two young people in his care, and it began almost the instant he had access to them. The speed of it is part of what makes the case so disturbing. Most of the stories on this list are about men and women who hid for years or decades. This was a man who walked into a school and started causing harm within weeks, suggesting that the conduct was not something the environment slowly corrupted in him, but something he arrived already prepared to do. It ended quickly, at least the school part of it did. On the 4th of January 2022, just months after he started, the school terminated him once the allegations were reported, and it notified law enforcement. To the school's credit, once it knew, it acted. But the speed of his removal also underlined how fast the harm had been done. He had been a teacher for a single semester, and in that semester he had managed to begin abusing two of his students. There had been no slow slide, no years of escalation that someone might have noticed and stopped. The danger had arrived fully formed. From there, the case moved into investigation and charging, handled by the Maricopa County Attorney's Office under County Attorney Rachel Mitchell. The specific local agency, the judge, and the defense attorney were never clearly identified in the public reporting that followed, an unusual gap that fit the strangely quiet way the whole case was handled. The wheels of the court turned for the next few years, and in 2025, a Maricopa County jury convicted Kapahulehua on 17 felony counts. The list included the most serious categories of offense the state recognizes for crimes against children, classified under Arizona law as dangerous crimes against children, along with additional charges of abuse and assault. Each of those classifications carries its own heavy mandatory weight. Arizona treats this category of crime more harshly than almost any other, precisely because the victims are children and the breach of trust is so severe. Where many sentences are allowed to run at the same time, these are stacked one after another, and for many of the counts there is no possibility of early release built into the law at all. The result is a number designed not to be served in a single human lifetime, but to guarantee that the person never walks free again. On the 17th of October 2025, he was sentenced to 187 years in prison. That staggering number is a function of Arizona law, which treats the gravest crimes against children as a special category and stacks the sentences, for them one on top of another, rather than allowing them to be served all at once. For many of those counts, the law bars any early release at all. The effect is a sentence so long it stops being a number a human being can serve and becomes simply a guarantee. A man who had been employed as a teacher for barely 5 months would never be free again, the law ensuring he could never harm another child. A man who had been in a classroom for barely 5 months would now spend the rest of his life, many times over, behind bars. There is a strange and telling footnote to this case, one that says something about how quietly these things can move through the system. When Kapahulehua was sentenced, it was the first time most of the public, and even much of the local press, learned the case existed at all. There had been no press release at the time of his arrest. The county attorney, Rachel Mitchell, acknowledged the oddity of that directly, noting that in cases involving a school or a church, there is usually a public announcement from the agency involved, and here there had not been one. When her office did finally speak, Mitchell laid out the heart of it. She described how the defendant had used his position as a teacher to manipulate the trust of these students and take advantage of them, and she praised the 2 young women for the courage it took to come forward, stop him from victimizing any children ever again. That last phrase matters, because it frames what these young people actually accomplished. By speaking up, they did not just secure their own justice. They removed a dangerous man from any future classroom, protecting children who will never know they were spared. It is the same grim arithmetic that runs through every one of these cases. The only thing that reliably stops a teacher like this is a victim brave enough to be believed. The systemic failure in this case is not a story of ignored complaints stretching back years, because there were no years. The failure here is quieter and in some ways more unsettling. A standard background check and a valid clearance card, the very tools meant to keep dangerous people out of classrooms, cleared a man who began offending within weeks of being hired. The safeguards did exactly what they were designed to do, and they were not nearly enough. And the near silence around the arrest, the fact that the community only found out at the very end, raised real questions about how openly these cases are handled when the accused is someone a school once vouched for. The school itself, when it finally spoke, called his actions reprehensible and completely contrary to the values it claimed to uphold. But parents in that community had a fair question of their own. If a teacher could be quietly arrested, quietly charged, and quietly tried, with the public only learning the truth at the moment of sentencing, how were other families supposed to know what had happened in their own children's school? Transparency, it turned out, was its own kind of safeguard, and in this case, it had been almost entirely absent. Other parents, at other schools, had no way of knowing a man like this had ever been caught, which is exactly the kind of silence that lets a problem teacher resurface somewhere new. Kapahulehua had come to the classroom by an unusual road. With time in the army behind him and a master's degree in teaching earned only a couple of years before he was hired, he had no history that would have stopped anyone, and a credential that opened every door. The conviction on 17 separate felony counts, and the sentence that stacked them into nearly 2 centuries, reflected a court determined that this man, who had treated a single semester of access as license to harm 2 of his students, would never have access to another. Corey Kapahulehua was stopped fast, which is its own small mercy. But speed is not the same as prevention, and the next case drags us into the place these stories are hardest to sit with, a first-grade classroom, and a teacher whose own school district had, not long before, publicly honoured him as a hero. Subscribe if you want to keep following the cases the headlines moved on from too quickly. It costs nothing, and it helps more than you would think. Case 5. Dwayne Sanders. Less than 2 years before he was led out of a courtroom in handcuffs, his school district had given him an award. They called it being a hero. He was a first-grade teacher, which means the children in his care were among the youngest and most defenseless in the entire school, and the recognition he had received made the families around him trust him even more completely. That trust is the thread running through every case on this list, and few people ever exploited it more coldly than Dwayne Sanders. Sanders taught first grade at Wallace A. Smith Elementary School in Ottawa, Tennessee, part of the Hamilton County school system. In April of 2021, that system, known as HCS, formally recognized him as one of its heroes. He was, by the accounts of the people around him, a beloved figure. When his case eventually went to trial, 6 separate character witnesses stood up for him, several of them saying they still trusted him with their own children even then. He was the kind of teacher a community builds its confidence around, and he was 47 years old at trial when that confidence finally collapsed. The award mattered more than it might seem. When an institution formally tells parents that a man is a hero, it is not just praising him, it is vouching for him, lending him the credibility of the whole school system, and making it that much harder for anyone to imagine he could be dangerous. Sanders wore that institutional blessing like armor, and the families around him believed in it completely. The victims were 7 little boys, 6 and 7 years old, all of them first graders he taught during the 2022 and 2023 school year. The district attorney who prosecuted the case would come to call them the Heroic Seven, and the name fits because what those small children eventually did took more courage than most adults could summon. They came from different classes and different years, which meant that piecing the full picture together required investigators to connect accounts from children who, in some cases, barely knew one another. That the same patterns surfaced again and again from one small child after another is exactly what made the case against Sanders so difficult for anyone to wave away. What was done to those children is not something this account will put into words. What can be said is that it happened inside an ordinary first-grade classroom during the ordinary school day to children who were barely old enough to put words to what was being done to them. One mother later described her son, a little boy who lived with epilepsy and attention difficulties, and who had depended on Sanders heavily just to get through the school day, suffering a major seizure after school on the very day he found the words to tell her. The cruelty of that is hard to overstate. A child who needed his teacher more than most, who relied on that adult simply to communicate and function in the classroom, had that dependence turned against him. The very trust that should have protected him became the thing that made him a target, and his small body broke under the strain of finally saying it out loud. The reckoning began in 2023, when Sanders was reported and immediately suspended. He has not worked for the district since. His trial ran from late May into early June of 2025 in Hamilton County Criminal Court before Judge Barry Steelman. The evidence included the recorded forensic interviews of the young boys, conducted carefully at a children's advocacy center so that the children themselves would not have to carry the full weight of testifying live. A detective described photographing a particular chair from the classroom because he believed that was where the crimes had occurred. A quiet, ordinary object turned into evidence of something terrible. The forensic interviews themselves had been conducted with great care at a children's advocacy center, a setting designed so that very young witnesses could describe what had happened to them without the trauma of a live courtroom confrontation. It was through those recordings that the jury came to understand what these first graders had endured in the children's own halting words, and it was those words more than anything that sealed the verdict. The case was led by a Hamilton County detective named Scott Terry, working alongside the district attorney's office and the forensic interviewers at the Children's Advocacy Center. After the case became public, investigators said they were quickly overwhelmed, a sign of just how many people this one classroom had touched. After about 10 hours of deliberation across 2 days, on the 5th of June, 2025, the jury convicted Sanders on every single one of the 15 charges he faced. His bond was revoked on the spot and he was taken into custody. The beloved hero of 2 years earlier, now a convicted man awaiting his sentence. At trial, 6 character witnesses had still spoken up for him, several insisting they would trust him with their own children, a measure of how deeply the false image had taken hold. What emerged at the sentencing phase made the picture even darker. A forensic psychologist who evaluated Sanders testified that he had admitted to possessing dozens of illegal images of children, a body of criminal conduct that had not even been part of the original investigation. The evaluation concluded that he had a fixation on children, and that he posed a high risk of doing this again. In other words, the 7 boys in that classroom were almost certainly not the beginning, and would not have been the end. The evaluation, conducted by a forensic psychologist who testified at the sentencing hearing, also concluded that he was at high risk of doing this again if he ever had the chance, and that he carried a fixation on children of exactly the age he had taught. The testimony painted a picture of a man whose presence in a first-grade classroom had never been safe, whose entire career had placed him precisely where his impulses were most dangerous. The award the district had given him 2 years earlier looked, in that light, like a catastrophic failure of judgment, an institution celebrating a man it had never truly seen. The original investigation, in other words, had captured only a portion of the danger he represented. What had looked to the community like a single shocking case was, on closer examination, the visible edge of something much larger that he had managed to keep hidden behind the hero's reputation the district itself had handed him. On the 28th of January, 2026, Sanders was sentenced to 60 years in state prison, with no parole, along with lifetime registration as an offender and lifetime supervision. There is an important and frustrating piece of legal nuance here that the district attorney took care to explain publicly, because it would be easy to misread the number. Tennessee had recently passed a law mandating a life sentence for the most serious of these crimes against a child. But the way the counts in this particular indictment had to be structured forced them to be merged together under the law, and that merger is what made a life sentence legally unavailable. As the district attorney put it, it was not that the state asked for 60 years instead of life. It was that, under the law as it applied to these specific charges, the state simply could not ask for life. She wanted the public to understand that distinction clearly, because a community that had watched a beloved teacher be convicted deserved to know that the prosecutors had pursued every ounce of punishment the statutes allowed them. The ceiling in this case was set by the way the law forced the counts together, not by any hesitation on the part of the people fighting for those 7 boys. The 60 years was, in effect, the most the structure of the case would allow, the maximum penalty on the lead count with everything else folded into it. It is an important point to be precise about, because the headline number can be misleading. The state did not go soft. The prosecutors pushed for everything the law permitted, and the law, in this instance, capped what they could pursue. The result is a man who will not be eligible for parole, who will carry lifetime registration and lifetime supervision, and who will, in all likelihood, spend the remainder of his life in a Tennessee prison cell. The district attorney also gave those 7 boys something lasting in a statement that was shared widely. She described how 7 young children, who had the terrible misfortune of being assigned to Dwayne Sanders' first-grade class, took the witness stand to speak their truth, and how they were articulate, kind, respectful, honest, and strong, and how not one of them wavered. The school principal testified about the lasting damage to the whole school community, children who withdrew from school, families who would struggle with trust for years to come, the slow ripple of harm that spreads outward from a case like this, long after the courtroom empties. A whole community of parents was left to wonder what they had missed, to second-guess the ordinary trust that lets a parent hand a 6-year-old over to a stranger every weekday morning. That trust, once broken this badly, does not easily heal. It is perhaps the most lasting damage these teachers leave behind, a corrosion of the basic faith that schools are safe. The forensic psychologist who evaluated Sanders had told the court he posed a high risk of harming children again, and that his interest was fixed on children of exactly the age he had been entrusted to teach. The district attorney, who had named the 7 boys the heroic 7, described how each of them had taken the witness stand and spoken with a steadiness that shamed the grown men who had vouched for their abuser. They were articulate, she said, and honest and strong, and not one of them wavered. 60 years later, that is the image worth keeping from this case. Not the man, but the 7 small witnesses who refused to be silenced. The superintendent confirmed that Sanders had been suspended the moment the first allegations surfaced, and had not been employed by the district since, careful, as institutions in these cases always are, to mark the distance between the school and the man it had once celebrated. Civil litigation over the case remained pending, but no settlement and no statement could undo what had been done or answer the question those families were left holding. They had trusted him because they had been told, in writing and with a ceremony, that he was worthy of it. But the fact that sits at the center of this case, the one that connects it to every other story here, is the timing of that award. In April of 2021, the district called Dwayne Sanders a hero. Less than 2 years later, he was abusing the smallest children in his building. Parents trusted him precisely because the institution had told them he was worthy of trust, and that institutional blessing is exactly the cover these offenders rely on. It is a pattern that repeats with an almost unbelievable regularity the closer you look at who these people were before they were exposed, because the next teacher on this list had not just been called a hero, she had been named the best of them all. Case 6. Jacqueline Marr. The county had just handed her one of the highest honors a teacher can receive. She was named one of the best educators in all of San Diego County, celebrated in a ceremony, held up as an example of what a teacher should be. And at the exact moment that award was being pinned to her name, she was secretly manipulating the trust of a 12-year-old boy in her own classroom. The honor and the crime were not years apart. They were happening at the same time. Her name is Jacqueline Ma. She was born in 1988, and she taught 6th grade at Lincoln Acres Elementary School in National City, in San Diego County, California. She had been hired by the National School District back in 2013 and had spent roughly a decade building her career and her reputation there. She held a bachelor's degree in biology and a master's in education, both from the University of California, San Diego, written and spoken as UC San Diego. She was credentialed, educated, and respected, the complete package, and that completeness is part of what makes the case so unsettling. There was no obvious flaw, no visible warning, nothing about her on paper that would have told a parent to be careful. By every external measure, she was an exemplary young teacher, energetic and accomplished, the kind a district loves to promote and put in front of cameras. And in 2022, she was named one of the San Diego County Office of Education's Teachers of the Year. It was the kind of recognition that follows a person for the rest of their career, the official seal of a community's trust. And it was bestowed on her at the precise moment she was using her classroom to get close to a child. The timing is not a coincidence to be noted and set aside. It is the entire lesson of her case. The award did not fail to detect the abuse. It actively obscured it, because no one scrutinizes the teacher the county just crowned. Excellence, real or performed, buys silence and benefit of the doubt, and Ma spent both. She had no criminal history. She was, on paper, exactly the person parents hope stands at the front of their child's classroom. The victims were 2 of her 6th grade students, 2 boys, at a school that served a working-class community where families placed enormous faith in their teachers. The manipulation of one of them was even framed, in part, as a kind of after-school program, an innocent-sounding cover for time alone. That is how this works. The abuse hides inside the ordinary structures of school life, the tutoring, the clubs, the extra help, the messaging on a school device, so that to an outside eye, nothing looks out of place until it is far too late. One was 11 at the time of his abuse back in 2020. The other was 12 when she began manipulating his trust. The form the abuse took is not something this account is going to detail. What matters is the method, because it tells you how carefully this was done. One of the boys had no phone and no social media account of his own, so Ma reached him through the tablets the school itself issued to students, and through a messaging feature buried inside a video game. She used the tools of the classroom, the very devices meant to help children learn, as the channels to get to one of them. She gave both boys gifts, clothing and gaming items, the small currency of attention that builds a false sense of specialness in a child. With the second boy, prosecutors said the 2 had even arranged a plan to meet alone in her classroom, an encounter the boy ultimately fled from because he was frightened. These were not impulsive moments. They were the steps of a deliberate process, carried out by an adult who knew exactly what she was doing and used her authority to keep a child from understanding it. It came apart in March of 2023, only months after that Teacher of the Year ceremony, when the mother of one boy found messages on a family tablet and went straight to the National City Police Department. The lead detective, Colleen Stanich, began to pull the thread, and what she found was damning. A search of Ma's phone turned up a hidden application containing explicit material involving the boy, along with messages in which Ma described her feelings for him in terms no teacher should ever have for a student. When the detective confronted her, Ma offered a line that would follow her through the rest of the case, admitting that things were complicated and that she may have blurred the lines. There were no blurred lines. There was a teacher and there was a child. The messages Ma had sent told their own story, directing the boy to delete what they wrote to each other, or to use a feature on a social app that makes messages vanish after they are read. She understood that what she was doing had to be hidden, which is its own kind of confession, the careful work of someone who knew the conduct was a crime and built in ways to cover the tracks. Ma was arrested and charged. The case was prosecuted by the San Diego County District Attorney's Office, and prosecutors initially filed 18 felony counts, with more added as the second boy's case came into focus. At a preliminary hearing in late 2023, the judge reviewing the evidence said plainly that it was overwhelmingly clear the defendant had taken advantage of 2 children and ordered her to stand trial on a long list of felony counts. The hidden application on Ma's phone was central to the state's case, a concealed digital space she had used to store explicit material and private messages deliberately kept out of sight. It was the work of someone who understood she had to hide what she was doing, and who built the tools to do it, even as she stood in front of a classroom each day as an award-winning teacher. Ma never went to trial. In February of 2025, months before she was scheduled to face a jury, she pleaded guilty to 4 counts, including the most serious categories of abuse, and admitted enhancements covering multiple victims. She had been facing the possibility of a sentence of 165 years to life, a number that reflected the gravity of the charges and the multiple victim enhancements attached to them. By pleading, she capped her exposure, but only somewhat. The decision to resolve the case short of trial was, in the end, less a strategy than an acknowledgement. The evidence against her, the hidden application, the messages, the explicit material, the detective's testimony, was simply too overwhelming to fight. The reduction from a possible 165 years to the sentence she ultimately received was real, but no one walking into that courtroom mistook the outcome for leniency. The plea spared the 2 boys the ordeal of testifying in front of a jury about the worst experiences of their young lives, which is often the quiet mercy these agreements provide. The children did not have to relive it on a witness stand. The case was already overwhelming, and Ma chose not to make them prove it. On the 9th of May, 2025, Judge Enrique Camarena sentenced Jacqueline Ma to 30 years to life in state prison, with no chance of parole consideration until those 30 years were served, and lifetime registration as an offender. The judge said something at sentencing that cuts to the very center of why this case belongs on this list. He observed that the manipulation had occurred in plain sight, and that the true nature of what she was doing went unrecognized precisely because she was a well-regarded, award-winning teacher. Read that again. The award was not just an honor she happened to hold. It was camouflage. The very recognition that should have signaled excellence instead functioned as a shield, making the people around her less likely, not more, to see what was in front of them. The district attorney called Ma's betrayal of her students despicable, a violation of trust in the most extreme and traumatic way possible. And Ma herself, given the chance to speak, said she was deeply ashamed that she had violated the commitment she once made to be the kind of teacher every parent hopes for, and that instead of guiding her students, she had stolen something from their childhoods that she could never give back. It was, by the standard of these cases, an unusually direct admission, and her words were striking. She said she had ripped away the childhood of her students, instead of following the path of what a teacher should be. The district attorney was less forgiving, describing Ma's conduct as despicable and a betrayal of trust in the most extreme and traumatic way imaginable. But no admission undoes the harm, and no apology answers the obvious question. How does a person actively abusing a child get named the best teacher in the county at the same time? The honest answer is that the system was looking at her performance and her polish, and never once looked underneath them. The manipulation, as the judge noted, happened in plain sight. The communications flowed through school-issued devices that nobody was monitoring closely enough. The award ceremony, the lesson plans, the glowing reputation, all of it formed a surface so convincing that the reality underneath went unseen until a mother happened to pick up a family tablet and read what was on it. Without that one moment of a parent's attention, there is no telling how long it would have continued. A prosecutor used the case to issue a warning to every parent who would listen that no space on the internet is truly safe for a child. Not a game, not a school tablet, not a messaging app built to make words disappear. Ma had used all of them, and the lead detective's patient work, tracing the hidden application and the deleted messages, is the only reason the full picture ever emerged. It took a watchful mother and a determined investigator to see through a reputation the entire county had endorsed. The judge who reviewed the evidence early on had called it overwhelmingly clear that 2 children had been taken advantage of, and the district attorney had labelled Ma's conduct despicable, a betrayal of trust in the most traumatic way imaginable. Ma is now serving a sentence that will keep her behind bars for at least 3 decades, with lifetime registration on top of it. Her name, once attached to a county honour, is now attached to a conviction, and the award that should have meant the highest standard of trust, instead stands as a warning about how easily that trust can be performed by someone who has no right to it. There was a practical lesson buried in this case too. One a prosecutor made a point of stating for every parent listening. No corner of the internet is truly safe for a child, not a school tablet, not a video game chat. Ma exploited exactly the digital spaces adults tend to assume are harmless, and she did it while wearing the credibility of a county award. The next teacher on this list also held a Teacher of the Year title, but where Ma's victims were 2, his were counted in the many, and the warning signs at his school had been quietly noticed long before anyone acted. Quick favour before the next one. Hit subscribe so these deep dives keep finding you. Free to do, and it keeps this work alive. Case 7. Manuel Ponce. In May of 2018, his school named him Teacher of the Year. He was the 2nd grade teacher everyone seemed to love, the safe pair of hands, the man the school chose to celebrate above all his colleagues, and parents felt lucky when their daughters were assigned to his class. And within roughly a year of that honour, he was abusing the little girls in that very classroom, one after another, in a pattern that would eventually involve far more children than anyone first realised, hidden behind a reputation the school itself had polished and put on display. His name is Manuel Ponce. He taught 2nd grade at Sutton Elementary School in Houston, Texas, part of the Houston Independent School District, written and read as HISD. He had earned his Texas teaching certificate in 2015, and in a detail that should make your stomach turn, he renewed that certificate in October of 2021, well after the abuse had already begun. The renewal is a small bureaucratic act, a box checked, a fee paid, but in hindsight it is grotesque. While he was actively harming children, the official machinery of the state was quietly affirming his fitness to keep teaching them. The systems built to credential and monitor educators registered nothing at all because they were never designed to catch what was actually happening inside that room. In May of 2018, he was named Sutton Elementary's Teacher of the Year. He resigned from the district in July of 2022 before any criminal investigation had started, and he had no prior criminal record. The earliest charged conduct, according to court documents, reached back to early 2020, which means he had been offending for a substantial stretch while continuing to teach, continuing to be trusted, continuing to be the man parents requested for their children. The gap between when the harm began and when anyone in authority knew about it measured not in days but in years, years in which a celebrated teacher moved freely through a building full of the very children he was harming. He left, in other words, on his own terms, with his reputation still intact and nothing in his record to warn anyone. That timing matters enormously. A teacher who resigns quietly, before any investigation begins, carries no red flag into the world with him. Had the first child not come forward months later, Ponce might simply have moved on to another school, another district, another classroom full of trusting families, with a clean file and a Teacher of the Year line still on his resume. The victims were his 2nd grade students, little girls who were 7 and 8 years old at the time. The case centered on 8 young girls, all of them his 2nd grade students. The nature of what he did is not something to be spelled out here. What can be said is that it happened inside his classroom, during the ordinary school day, woven into the routines of a 2nd grade class, and that it continued across more than one school year. The first child to come forward did so in the fall of 2022, telling a teacher at the school what Ponce had done. That single outcry from one brave little girl is what finally set everything in motion. She told a teacher at the school in early November of 2022 what Ponce had done to her, the first break in a silence that had held for years. From that one disclosure, the dam broke. As investigators and child protection workers began speaking with students, more children described similar experiences, and the scale of what had been happening inside that 2nd grade classroom began to come into focus. It is a pattern that recurs across nearly all of these cases. One child finds the courage to speak, and only then does anyone realize how many others had been carrying the same secret. The school's principal wrote to parents at the end of January 2023, disclosing that there was an investigation underway, the first many families heard of any of it. For parents who had trusted this teacher, who had perhaps celebrated when their daughters were placed in the class of the school's Teacher of the Year, that letter was the floor giving way. The state's Child Protection Agency would go on to conduct forensic interviews with more than a dozen children, a number that turned a quiet suspicion into an unmistakable pattern, and made clear that this was not the story of a single victim, but of a classroom, systematically betrayed. On the 10th of February 2023, Ponce was arrested by the Houston School District's own police department. He was initially charged with multiple felony counts, including the most serious continuous abuse charges Texas law provides, and he posted bond, walking free to await trial. The arrest itself came only after the principal's letter, only after the first child's outcry had climbed through the school and into the hands of investigators. Until that one little girl decided to tell a teacher, the man had been operating entirely undetected, protected by routine and reputation. Then, several months later, a new victim came forward, and a lesser charge was upgraded to a felony, expanding the case further. The state's Child Protection Agency confirmed that forensic interviews had been conducted with more than a dozen children, a staggering figure for a single second-grade teacher. Those forensic interviews, carried out at a children's assessment center built specifically for this kind of work, allowed very young witnesses to describe what had happened to them in a safe setting rather than the raw confrontation of a courtroom. A clinical psychologist also testified during the proceedings, helping the jury understand the behavior of abused children, including why young victims so often delay disclosing what has happened to them. The case was prosecuted by the Harris County District Attorney's Office. By the time it reached a jury, what had begun as a report from a single 10-year-old had become a case built on the corroborating accounts of many children, each one describing a version of the same betrayal by the same trusted man. And during the week of the 16th through the 19th of December, 2024, a jury convicted Manuel Ponce and sentenced him to life in prison. Now, that life sentence carries a weight that deserves to be spelled out precisely, because in Texas it means very nearly the harshest thing the words can mean. The charge he was convicted under, the continuous abuse of a young child, carries a mandatory minimum of 25 years, and under Texas law, a person serving that kind of mandatory minimum is not eligible for parole at all. Probation and deferred sentencing are also off the table. So while the headline says life, the practical reality is a life sentence with no road to release, a man who will grow old and die in a Texas prison. Texas reserves this structure for the gravest offenses against its youngest children, precisely because lawmakers wanted to remove any possibility, a future in which someone like Ponce walks free. For the families, that finality matters. Whatever else is uncertain in their lives going forward, the one thing they will never have to fear is the sight of him standing in front of children again. The verdict and the life sentence came down during that week before the holidays in December of 2024, closing a case that had begun with one frightened child speaking up 2 years earlier. A mother of one of the victims spoke after the sentencing in words that are hard to read without feeling them. She had waited a long time for that day, through the arrest, the bond, the new victims coming forward, the slow grind of the court calendar, holding her family together while the case wound toward its end. The school's principal had been the one to first put the investigation in writing to the parents, and the state's child protection workers had carried out forensic interviews with more than a dozen children before it was over. What had been celebrated only a few years earlier as the school's finest teacher had become the subject of one of the most disturbing classroom investigations the district had ever seen. The Teacher of the Year banner and the life sentence belonged to the same man, separated by only a handful of years. She said that, thanks be to God, the outcome was more than they had expected, and that the families had needed to become the voice of these girls, because Ponce had taken their voices away the moment he began abusing them. She spoke of going home to hug her daughter and tell her that they had done it, that her little girl had been brave, that she had been the voice of many girls. A father described the after effects he believed would stay in his daughter's mind for the rest of her life. These families had done nothing wrong. They had simply sent their daughters to school, to a teacher the institution had publicly honored and trusted that the building would keep them safe. The courage it took for the children to speak and for the parents to stand up in a courtroom and describe what it had done to their families is the reason Ponce was convicted at all. Without the first child's outcry, the pattern would have stayed buried, and a man with a clean resignation and a Teacher of the Year award would have carried on. These are the real sentences in this case, the ones the families will serve forever. The life term handed to Ponce will keep him away from children, but it cannot reach back and return what was taken from those girls, the ordinary, unguarded childhood that every one of them deserved. The families spoke of being the voice of children who had been silenced, and there is something both triumphant and unbearably sad in that. They won, the man is gone for good, and still they will spend the rest of their lives helping their daughters carry it. And as in so many of these stories, the warnings were there to be seen. 2 teachers at Sutton had been concerned about Ponce's classroom routine, about the way his students took unusually long bathroom breaks and ended up unattended. But those concerns did not surface in time to stop him. He had renewed his teaching credential while actively offending. 2 teachers at the school had actually noticed something off about Ponce's classroom routine, the unusual length of his students' bathroom breaks, children left unattended in hallways, but their concerns did not rise into action in time to matter. The state's education agency had not flagged him on any do not hire list at the time of his arrest, because nothing had yet been proven. And the Teacher of the Year award from 2018 had done exactly what such honours do in these cases, cementing the trust of parents who had every reason to believe their daughters were in the safest possible hands. Every protective layer that was supposed to catch a man like this had, in one way or another, looked right past him. The next case carries that same betrayal of a position of trust across an ocean onto an American military base, where the victims were the daughters of the very service members the school existed to support. Case 8. Stefan Zappi. He taught the children of American soldiers on an American military base in Germany for 20 years. He was named a Teacher of the Year there, and for at least 4 of those years, he was abusing the little girls in his care, the daughters of service members who had trusted the school on the base to be a safe place while they served their country. A complaint was raised about him in 2009. He kept teaching for another 11 years. His name is Stefan Zappi. He taught first through 3rd grade at Alexander Patch Elementary School on Patch Barracks at the United States Army Garrison in Stuttgart, Germany. It was a school run by the Department of Defense Education Activity, the federal system known as DODEA, which educates the children of American military families stationed overseas. Zappi was employed there for 2 full decades, from 2001 to 2021. In 2007, he was named the Teacher of the Year for his district within the overseas school system, a formal honor inside a federal institution, the kind of recognition that signals to an entire community that this person has been vetted and valued. He had no prior criminal record. For a man who would later be exposed as one of the most dangerous people ever to stand in one of those classrooms, the award was not a fluke of oversight. It was the system working exactly as designed, and still seeing nothing, because the things it measured had nothing to do with the danger he actually posed. To the military families who rotated through Stuttgart, he was a fixture, a trusted, decorated educator at the heart of their tight-knit community. Military families are uniquely dependent on the schools attached to their bases. They move often, far from extended family and familiar support, and the base school becomes one of the few stable, trusted institutions in their children's lives. Parents serving their country overseas had every reason to believe that the award-winning teacher down the hall was exactly the safe presence school presented him to be. That dependence is what made the betrayal so complete. The victims were 4 girls, all of them daughters of American service members, all of them between 6 and 8 years old when the abuse occurred between 2006 and 2010. What he did to them does not need describing. One of the girls, abused when she was 8, would later tell investigators, heartbreakingly, that at the time she did not even understand it was wrong. He had called her to his desk during class, court documents indicate, in the middle of an ordinary school day, surrounded by other children who saw nothing amiss. The abuse hidden in plain sight inside the most normal of settings. That is the terrible logic of how these crimes are committed against the very young. They unfold in plain sight, folded into the normal rhythm of a classroom, against children too small to recognize what is being done or to find the words to report it. The youngest victims are, in a sense, the safest for an offender to choose, and Zappi chose first, second and third graders. That single sentence captures the particular cruelty of crimes against the very young. They are too small to name what is being done to them, which is precisely why they are chosen. Colleagues and other students had, over the years, noticed Zappi behaving inappropriately with children, patterns of physical contact that stood out as wrong, according to court documents. Faculty members observed him keeping children unusually close, in ways that made them uncomfortable. And yet, for years, those observations went unreported, or were noticed and quietly tolerated, filed away as the eccentricity of a long-serving and celebrated teacher, rather than recognized as the warning signs they were. The decoration he wore as Teacher of the Year made him harder, not easier to question. Here is the failure that defines this case. In 2009, a 6-year-old told her parents that Zappi had touched her inappropriately. Those parents did the right thing. They reported it to the administrators at Patch and asked that their daughter be moved to a different class. And that is exactly what happened. And only that, the child was moved, Zappi was not. No one called the military police. No one called civilian law enforcement. No one launched a real investigation into a teacher accused of touching a 6-year-old. The matter was treated as an interpersonal problem to be managed quietly, a child to be shuffled to a different room, rather than the criminal allegation it plainly was. And so the man kept his classroom, his award still on the wall, his access to children completely intact. No discipline, no referral to law enforcement, no real investigation. The complaint was resolved by quietly relocating the victim, and the man stayed right where he was, in a classroom full of other people's children. For 11 more years, it is worth sitting with the arithmetic of that decision. A specific child made a specific allegation, and the institution's answer was to move the child away from the danger rather than the danger away from the children. Every harm Zappi caused after 2009, every additional victim, unfolded in a stretch of time that should never have existed, opened up by an administration that treated a report of abuse as a classroom transfer request. What finally stopped him came almost by accident. In the summer of 2020, a teacher from Patch, visiting the United States, happened to hear one of Zappi's former students disclose that she hated him because of what he had done to her. That teacher reported it to the Army Criminal Investigation Division, written and read as CID. The case quickly grew into a joint investigation between Army CID and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, in Atlanta. Zappi was removed from the classroom in early 2020, and in the summer of 2021, while he was visiting the United States on vacation, he was arrested. The investigation was pursued as part of a national program dedicated to combating the exploitation of children and the work of building a case around crimes committed years earlier and an ocean away was painstaking. Investigators had to locate former students who had since moved all over the country with their military families and persuade them to revisit the worst memories of their childhoods. Because the crimes had been committed on federal extraterritorial property, the case was prosecuted in federal court in the United States, specifically in the Northern District of Georgia, in Atlanta, under a law that allows the American government to prosecute certain crimes committed overseas. The trial unfolded in federal court in Atlanta, the venue dictated by the unusual jurisdiction, since the crimes had occurred on United States military property overseas. Prosecutors leaned on the testimony of the 4 victims, on the corroborating observations of former students and colleagues, and on the documented 2009 complaint that the school had failed to escalate. On the 18th of January 2023, a federal jury convicted Zappi on all 8 counts he faced, the most serious categories of abuse against children. The mandatory minimum was 30 years. The government argued that nothing short of life would do, given how long he had operated and how many chances the institution had missed to stop him. On the 2nd of May, 2023, he was sentenced to life in federal prison, plus a financial penalty, and taken into the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. For a man who had spent 2 decades inside a trusted institution, decorated and unquestioned, The fall was total and final. He would not be moved to a quieter assignment, or allowed to resign and disappear, or handed any of the soft exits that had let other accused teachers slip away over the years. The federal system had reached across an ocean and across more than a decade to hold him fully accountable, and the sentence ensured he would never stand in front of children again. The mandatory minimum had been 30 years. The government asked for life, and the court agreed. The officials who handled the case did not mince words. A senior Justice Department official noted that Zappi's crimes were especially egregious because he had been entrusted with teaching the children of the nation's service members overseas, families who had sacrificed to serve and who deserved to know their children were safe. A United States attorney emphasized that Zappi had abused a critical position of trust and that the community was safer with him, no longer able to reach children. The investigation had been a joint effort between Army investigators and federal agents, a reflection of how seriously the government treats crimes against the children of those in uniform. The lead FBI official in Atlanta described him as the most dangerous type of offender, an educator who uses a position of trust to gain access to children and harm them for his own gratification. It is a description that could be laid, almost word for word, over every case on this list. The pattern is always the same. The role provides the access. The reputation provides the cover. The youngest, most defenseless children provide the targets. And an institution, somewhere along the way, provides the silence that lets it continue. Zappi simply ran the pattern longer and further from home than most, on a military base, against the daughters of soldiers. The case had been pursued as part of a national effort dedicated to protecting children from exploitation, and it required investigators to track down former students scattered across the country by the constant moves of military life. A senior Justice Department official called his crimes especially egregious precisely because he had been trusted with the children of those who serve. He had worn the title of Teacher of the Year inside a federal school system for the families of the armed forces, and he had used that exact standing for more than a decade after the first complaint to keep a classroom and the access it gave him. That phrase, a position of trust, echoes through every single case here. It is the common tool. It is the thing all of these people had, and the thing all of them weaponized. The case had been brought under a federal law allowing the United States to prosecute crimes committed by Americans on military property abroad, and it was pursued as part of a national initiative aimed at protecting children from exploitation. The officials involved made a point of crediting the courage of the victims and the persistence of the investigators, the people who finally undid what 11 years of institutional silence had allowed to stand. And the 11 years matter more than anything else in this case. A family reported him in 2009. The system's response was to move the child and leave the man. Every additional victim, every additional year of harm after 2009, traces back to that single decision to treat a report about a teacher as a scheduling problem rather than a crime. The next case returns to American soil, to a California elementary school, and to a teacher who did not just abuse his position. He built himself a private room to do it in. If you have made it this far, you are exactly who these are made for. Subscribe so the next case reaches you the moment it goes up. Case 9. Kim Kenneth Wilson. He convinced his school to give him a room, a windowless, soundproof room set aside for a club he founded and ran, where he could take students one at a time, alone, with the door closed behind them. For years, a long-time trusted elementary teacher operated what amounted to a private chamber inside a public school, and the institution did not just allow it. It had approved the whole arrangement, signed off on it, and called it a school activity, never once asking why a man would need a soundproof room alone with children. His name is Kim Kenneth Wilson. He was a longtime teacher at Del Paso Heights Elementary School in Sacramento, California, part of the Twin Rivers Unified School District, a fixture of the school across a career that spanned decades. At some point, he established a media and broadcasting club for students, and that club was given its own dedicated room. In a civil complaint, that room was later described as windowless, soundproofed, and even padded. Wilson requested it as the club's headquarters, and he got it, no questions asked. There is no version of that request that should have survived a moment's scrutiny, and yet it sailed through, because it came from a long-time, trusted teacher wrapped in the credibility of decades of service. That is the quiet horror of this case, the thing that made him dangerous. His standing in the school was the very thing that let him build the conditions for his crimes in full view of his colleagues. He had no prior criminal record on file. He was 62 years old when he was finally arrested, a veteran educator who had spent years quietly building exactly the conditions he needed. Think about the patience in that. We tend to picture an offender as someone who seizes a sudden opportunity. Wilson did the opposite. He created the opportunity, deliberately, over time, by establishing a club and persuading the school that it required a private, enclosed space of its own. He engineered his own access, and the institution helped him do it without ever recognizing what it was building. The victims were multiple female students. Across multiple years, one civil suit described the abuse of a 6th grade girl during one school year. Another involved a child who had been in 2nd grade, a little girl who, the filing alleged, was routinely pulled into that private room during class and recess. The span of the victims, from 2nd graders to 6th graders, across years, paints the picture of a man who treated an entire school as his hunting ground and the clubroom as his stage. The trust the community placed in him, built over a long and apparently distinguished career, is precisely what let him operate so openly. No one questions the beloved veteran teacher who started the popular broadcasting club. That is the whole point of being beloved. The form the abuse took is not something this account will describe, and the specific evidence recovered is not something it will catalogue, except to say that when investigators finally searched, what they found documented years of crimes against numerous students, and was as disturbing as anything in any of these cases. He took female students into that private room alone, during instructional time and during recess, and he used the privacy he had engineered to harm them and to create a record of it. That last part is among the most chilling aspects of the case. This was not abuse that happened and then faded into the contested space of memory and denial. There was documentation, evidence that spanned multiple years and numerous students, recovered when investigators finally searched. The room he had been given was not just where the crimes happened. It was, in effect, a studio for them, and the school had handed him the key. The path to justice here was long and, frankly, full of missed exits. As far back as 2014, a report involving Wilson was made to the school district's own police force, and the case was suspended, set aside, allowed to go cold. A child, or someone on a child's behalf, had raised an alarm, and the institution's response was to let the matter quietly lapse. That same year, according to later civil filings, Wilson was abusing a 6th grade girl. The report and the crime existed side by side, and the report lost. Had that 2014 complaint been pursued with any real urgency, years of subsequent abuse might never have happened at all. In 2019, a new victim came forward, again to the district police, who this time identified Wilson as a suspect and forwarded the matter to the Sacramento Police Department. Even with a named suspect and a second complaint years after the first, the case did not move with anything like the speed the situation demanded. And in a detail that says everything about institutional priorities, the district did not place Wilson on administrative leave when the police report came in. It placed him on leave only after a victim's attorney filed a formal public records request, forcing the matter into the open. The school system responded not to the danger but to the scrutiny, moving only when an outsider with the law on her side demanded that it explain itself. It is a distinction that should chill any parent, the difference between an institution that protects children and one that protects itself. The Sacramento police chief called the crimes unspeakable and reminded the public that the protection of children is a responsibility shared by everyone, an entire community. But it was a single attorney's records request, not the school's conscience, that finally pried Wilson loose from his classroom. He pleaded guilty rather than face a jury with the years of recovered evidence arrayed against us. Him and the judge sent him away for 215 years to life. The broadcasting club, the soundproof room, the decades of trust, all of it ended in a prison cell, far too late for the students who had been led, one at a time, behind that closed door. Even then, the wheels turned slowly. It was not until the early 2020s that the city police fully took on the case. Look at the timeline that allowed. A report in 2014, suspended. Another report in 2019, forwarded but not fully pursued for years. Each pause, each handoff, each suspended file represented more time in which Wilson kept his room and kept his access. The system did not lack information, it lacked urgency, and in cases like these, a lack of urgency is indistinguishable, to the children involved, from a lack of care. In a telling detail, the district only placed Wilson on administrative leave after a victim's attorney filed a public records request. Not immediately after the police report. The institution moved to protect itself, it seemed, only when an outsider started asking questions on the record. On the 20th of January, 2023, Sacramento police arrested Wilson, and search warrants were executed at his home. What investigators ultimately recovered documented years of crimes against numerous students, a body of evidence so substantial that it removed any doubt about the scale of what he had done. The case that the district had let lapse in 2014 and handled at arm's length in 2019 turned out to involve far more victims and far more harm than those early, neglected reports had ever captured. Every year of delay had been a year in which more children were exposed to a man the system already had reason to watch. He did not go to trial. On the 25th of February 2025, he pleaded guilty to 9 counts of committing lewd acts against a child and admitted aggravating factors including the vulnerability of his victims and his abuse of a position of trust. Then, on the 22nd of August 2025, Judge Satnam Ratu sentenced Kim Wilson to 215 years to life in state prison. Because of his age, he would be eligible for a form of elder parole only after serving 20 years. But at his age, even that is, in all likelihood, a life sentence. He was ordered to register for life. The plea itself, to 9 counts with admitted aggravating factors, spared his victims the trauma of testifying about years of abuse in open court, a small protection for children who had already endured far too much. The 215 years to life was, in practical terms, a guarantee that Kim Wilson had stood in front of his last classroom and taken his last student into that room, a final, permanent closing of a door the school had left open for far too long. The civil side of this case carried its own reckoning. One lawsuit against the school district was settled for $6 million, a figure that reflected the depth of the institution's failure as much as the harm done by Wilson himself. Because this was never solely the story of one man, it was the story of a school that gave him a private, soundproof room and never questioned it, that received a complaint in 2014 and let it lapse, that received another in 2019 and still did not move him until an outside attorney forced the issue. An offender like this needs opportunity, and at Del Paso Heights, the opportunity was built, approved, furnished, and protected by the institution around him. The attorney who had pushed the case forward placed the blame squarely where it belonged, describing a repeated pattern of schools putting their image and reputation over the safety of their students, turning a blind eye to complaints, and ignoring red flags. It is a sentence that could serve as the thesis for nearly every story here. Again and again, the institution had the information it needed: a report in 2014, a named suspect in 2019, a soundproof room that should have raised questions the day it was requested. The failure was never a lack of warning. It was a refusal to treat the warnings as more important than the institution's own comfort and image. The Sacramento police chief, for her part, called the crimes unspeakable and horrific, and reminded the public that children are the most vulnerable members of any community, and that protecting them is everyone's responsibility. It was a statement that, however heartfelt, sat uncomfortably beside the long record of reports that had not produced action sooner. The attorney who fought the civil case had been blunter, describing institutions that repeatedly chose their own image over the safety of the children in their care, and arguing that the warning signs in Wilson's case had been there to see for anyone willing to look. But the detail that should haunt anyone who hears this case is the room. A school let a single teacher operate a windowless, soundproof space, alone with children, as an official activity. Prosecutors described that room as the principal scene of his crimes. It was not a secret, it was sanctioned. The very institution that was supposed to protect those students handed Wilson the one thing every offender on this list needed most: privacy and unquestioned access, and it called the arrangement a broadcasting club. The final case on this list takes that institutional failure and stretches it across decades and multiple school districts. Following a man who was investigated, who left, and who was simply hired again somewhere new. Case 10, Andrew Palmore. He was investigated once, back in 2004, and he resigned, saying he was relocating. No charges, no warning attached to his file, nothing to stop the next district from hiring him. And so he taught for nearly 20 more years across multiple Central Texas elementary schools, leaving a trail of harmed children that the prosecutors who finally caught him admitted they could never fully measure. He is the living embodiment of the thing that lets these stories repeat, the danger that is quietly passed from one school to the next. His name is Andrew Palmore. He was first certified to teach in Texas in the year 2000, and over the next 2 decades he worked at a string of elementary schools across the Austin and San Marcos area. He began at Casey Elementary School in the Austin School District, where he taught from 2000 until May of 2004. He resigned then, citing relocation, and that quiet, ordinary-sounding exit is the hinge on which this entire tragedy turns. The Austin District, by its own later account, had investigated him in 2004, but he was allowed to leave on his own terms, his file clean, his stated reason for going unchallenged. A teacher under investigation simply walked out the door with nothing following him, and the next district that considered hiring him would have found a spotless record and a plausible story. Years later, he resurfaced in the Hayes School District, working as a substitute starting around 2012, and was hired full-time in 2014 at Blanco Vista Elementary School in San Marcos, where he taught 2nd, 4th, and 5th grade. In between and around those postings, his name surfaced in connection with still other districts in the region. Each move was a fresh start, a new building, a new roster of trusting parents, and at no point did the system that licensed and employed him assemble the full picture of a man drifting from school to school. He was, to each new employer, simply an available, certified teacher, and that was enough. He was 53 years old by the time he finally faced a jury, with what looked like an ordinary long career behind him, and a clean public record. That clean record is the engine of this entire tragedy. Every time Palmore moved on, he carried no formal mark of suspicion with him, which meant each new district saw only a certified, experienced elementary teacher with years of service. The very absence of a paper trail, an absence created by the way earlier concerns had been handled, is what allowed him to keep finding new classrooms full of new children. The victims spanned the full length of that career. At his trial, 6 children testified about what he had done to them, and so did 2 adult women. Those 2 women had been his students at Casey Elementary back in the early 2000s. One of them told a reporter that she had been having nightmares about it for 20 years. The other had carried her own version of the same pain for just as long. When they walked into that Hayes County courtroom as grown women to testify about a teacher who had harmed them when they were 7 and 8 years old, they were closing a loop that the system had left open for 2 decades. Their willingness to relive it, in public, in front of strangers, is what connected the dots between the man's earliest crimes and his most recent ones, and made the full, decades-long scope of his offending impossible to deny. Think about what that means. The crimes he committed in 2004 were still alive, still doing their damage, 2 decades later, in the mind of a grown woman who had been a small child in his classroom. The specifics of what he did are not the point of this account. What matters is its span more than 20 years, and the fact that the harm reached far beyond any single school or any single year. The 2 adult women who testified were not incidental to the case. Their presence transformed it, turning what might have looked like a recent series of crimes into the visible end of a pattern stretching back to the beginning of the century. They had been small children in his very first classroom, and they had carried the weight of it into adulthood, through jobs and relationships and the ordinary business of life, while the man who caused it simply moved to the next school. The case that finally brought him down started in February of 2022, when a child who had not even been one of his students reported abuse that had occurred at Palmore's home and at a park in San Marcos. The Kyle Police Department opened an investigation, led by a detective named Pedro Carrasco Jr., who would prove relentless in pulling the case apart. It was his work that uncovered the separate, earlier investigation by another agency, and his persistence that began to reveal how far back the pattern truly reached. A single report about a single child became, in his hands, the thread that unspooled an entire career of harm, pulling in victims from years and schools that had nothing to do with the original complaint. As the detective dug in, he discovered that there had been an earlier, separate investigation by the San Marcos police involving yet another child, tied to an incident at a park in late 2020 that Palmore had brushed off, in a police interview, as an accident. Palmore was arrested in March of 2022. By that point, in his own statements to police, he had admitted to harming multiple children and had even acknowledged that one of the victims was connected to that separate, earlier San Marcos investigation. The detective's discovery that a prior inquiry had existed involving a different child was a crucial moment because it revealed that the case in front of him was not isolated. It was one more entry in a long ledger, and it gave investigators the thread they needed to begin reconstructing the full scope of a career spent harming the young. There was also a warning closer in time that went unheeded. In 2020, the Hayes district placed Palmore on leave after a student complaint, and then, remarkably, returned him to the classroom. A separate incident at a park in late 2020, which Palmore brushed off to police as an accident, produced no charges at the time. The Hayes County School District eventually moved to terminate him, though Palmore fought that termination through the state's administrative process, and an administrative judge ultimately found the district's procedure technically invalid, a bureaucratic tangle that, however it resolved, did nothing to change what he had already done. But the criminal case marched forward. A grand jury indicted him in September of 2022, and after the long wait that serious cases require, his trial took place in Hayes County in October of 2025. The years between arrest and trial were their own ordeal for the victims and their families, who had to hold themselves ready to testify about the worst moments of their lives, not knowing exactly when that day would come. When it finally arrived, they did not flinch. On the 16th of October 2025, a jury convicted Andrew Palmore of the continuous abuse of children, and that same jury sentenced him the same day to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the maximum punishment Texas law allows for that crime. The other counts in the indictment, which had included numerous additional charges, were set aside once that conviction landed, because nothing could be added on top of life without parole. The district attorney who secured the verdict said it was impossible to know the true extent of Palmore's abuse, given how many years it had spanned and how many schools it had touched. That admission, from the very office that had just won the case, is its own kind of verdict on the system. The people whose job it was to stop him could put a name to the pattern, could win a conviction at last, and still could not say how many children had been harmed along the way. The district attorney who secured the conviction put the case in stark terms, saying it was impossible to know the true extent of Palmore's abuse, which had spanned more than 2 decades. An assistant district attorney told the court that children are the most vulnerable members of society, and that the children of the county had been made safer by ensuring this man would never have access to another child again. Those words are the small mercy at the end of a very long failure, because the hard truth of this case is that Palmore should have been stopped in 2004. An assistant district attorney described him, in the plainest terms the court would allow, as a dangerous man who would never again have access to a child, and framed the verdict as a measure that had made the county's children safer. It was a victory, but it was a victory 2 decades too late for the women who had testified about what had happened to them when they were 7 years old in the first classroom he was ever given. He was investigated by the Austin School District that year, and he was allowed to resign, citing relocation, and walk away with a clean employment file, free to be hired again and again across the region. Years later, the Hayes district placed him on leave over a student complaint and then returned him to the classroom. The Texas Education Commissioner, ruling on the termination dispute, even acknowledged that the district had correctly argued Palmore was being investigated for particularly heinous crimes with clear evidence of guilt, while still insisting the proper procedures had to be followed. His teaching certification, remarkably, remained valid until 2024 and was merely under review even after years of allegations had accumulated against him. The The state's education commissioner, weighing in on the termination dispute, acknowledged that the district had correctly argued Palmore was being investigated for particularly heinous crimes, with clear evidence of guilt, while still insisting that proper procedure had to be followed before a teacher could be fired. The result was a man credibly accused of grave crimes against children who nonetheless held a valid license to teach them. Years into the case, a final illustration of how slowly the gates close even when everyone can see the danger walking through them. At every gate where the system could have stopped him, it instead let him pass, and children paid for that failure for more than 20 years. It is the oldest and most dangerous pattern in every one of these cases. The trusted teacher moved quietly along instead of stopped, and Andrew Palmore rode it across an entire career. These 10 were trusted completely, many of them honoured by the very communities whose children they betrayed. And that trust is the one thing every story here has in common. The warning signs were almost always there. The question that should stay with us is whether anyone was willing to look. Subscribe so the next investigation finds you, and we will see you on the next case.